That illegal sinkhole you call a root cellar will be filled with concrete by Friday, at your expense, Mr. Henderson. This is a covenanted community, not a doomsday prepper compound. The voice, thick with entitlement, and the faint wheeze of exertion, belonged to Karen, the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. She stood on the edge of my freshly manicured lawn, her floral print muumuu a garish splash of color against the serene green. Her arms were crossed over a chest so prominent it seemed to enter a room a full second before the rest of her, a fleshy, battering ram of authority. Her face was a mask of pinched fury, her eyes narrowed to slits as she stared past me at the small, sloped wooden door set into the gentle rise of my backyard. It was the entrance to my root cellar, a project I'd spent the last 3 months building with my own 2 hands, a tribute to my grandfather and a gift from my wife, Laura, and her passion for canning the bounty from her garden. To Karen, it was a declaration of war. Her threat hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and suffocating, a promise of destruction aimed not just at a structure of wood and earth, but at a piece of my soul. The financial loss would be significant, but the sheer violation, the audacity of this woman to stand on my property and threaten to forcibly destroy what I had legally and lovingly built, sent a cold, sharp spike of anger through the disciplined calm I'd cultivated over 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. I looked from her furious, bloated face to the cellar door, a testament to careful planning, hard labor, and a deep-seated belief in self-reliance. And I knew this was a battle I could not lose. This wasn't just about a root cellar anymore. It was about principle. It was about a bully who had finally picked the wrong soldier to push around. What Karen didn't know was that in my world, you don't make threats you can't back up, and you never ever start a war without understanding your enemy's full capabilities. She had just fired the first shot, and I was about to show her what a strategic, full-scale response looked like. If you're ready for a story about how one HOA president's obsession with power led to her own public downfall, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've got your own HOA nightmare to share. You're not going to want to miss how this plays out, because the concrete she was so eager to pour ended up setting the foundation for her own spectacular ruin. Now let me take you back to how this all began, long before Karen's shadow ever fell across my lawn. The idea for the root cellar was born from a place of love. My wife Laura had a green thumb that was nothing short of miraculous. Our backyard wasn't just a lawn, it was a sprawling, vibrant tapestry of raised garden beds, trellises heavy with tomatoes and beans, and patches of earth that yielded potatoes, carrots, and onions in astonishing quantities. For years, her biggest challenge wasn't growing the food, but preserving it. Our pantry was perpetually overflowing, the shelves in the garage bowing under the weight of countless mason jars filled with jewel-toned jams, pickles, and sauces. She'd often sigh, half joking, that she needed a proper larder like her grandmother had on the farm in Vermont. That's when the memory hit me, a ghost from my own childhood. My grandfather, a man of calloused hands and quiet wisdom, showing me the dark, cool interior of his root cellar. The earthy smell, the sight of potatoes nestled in straw, the racks of apples and preserved pears. It was a sanctuary of sustenance, a testament to living with the land. He'd built it himself, digging into the hillside behind his house with a shovel and sheer determination. He taught me the principles of it, using the earth's constant, cool temperature to create a natural refrigerator. After 20 years as an engineer, planning and overseeing the construction of everything from bridges to barracks, building a simple root cellar felt like coming home. Before a single shovel of dirt was turned, I went to work. Not in the yard, but at my desk. I spent a week researching modern root cellar designs, ventilation requirements, and moisture control. I drew up a set of detailed blueprints, engineering them to be not just functional, but indestructible. The walls would be reinforced concrete block, waterproofed from the outside. The ceiling would be a precast concrete slab covered with a thick waterproof membrane and 2 feet of earth to provide insulation. I calculated load-bearing capacities and soil displacement. This wasn't going to be a hole in the ground. It was going to be a subterranean fortress of freshness. My next stop was the county planning and zoning office. I walked in with my blueprints, my property survey, and a polite, can-do attitude. The clerk, a weary-looking man named Dave, looked over my plans with a raised eyebrow. "A root cellar? Haven't seen an application for one of these in years," he mused. "Most folks in these new developments just want a wine cellar in the basement." I explained the project, its purpose, and walked him through my structural plans. He was impressed by the level of detail. "You've got your rebar schedule, your waterproofing specs. You an engineer or something?" he asked. "Something like that," I said with a smile. He stamped my application, took my fee, and told me I'd have the permit in 2 to 4 weeks. 3 weeks later, it arrived in the mail, an official green light from the one authority that truly mattered, the county. I specifically checked the Oak Ridge HOA bylaws before I started. I read the thick, convoluted document cover to cover. It had pages of rules about fence heights, mailbox colors, and the approved species of ornamental shrubs. It had clauses about sheds and outbuildings, requiring Architectural Review Committee approval. But there was not a single word, not a sentence, not a syllable about subterranean structures. It was a clear and unambiguous omission. An outbuilding is on top of the ground. My cellar was under it. Legally, I was in the clear. The construction was a joy. I rented a mini excavator for a weekend and carved a neat, precise hole into the gentle slope at the back of my property. I laid the footers, mortared the concrete blocks one by one, and felt a deep satisfaction with each level course. My son, home from college for the summer, helped me mix concrete and move blocks, a rare chance for us to work side by side, sweating and building something tangible together. When the structure was complete and the final layer of sod was laid over the top, it was almost invisible. All that could be seen was a gentle swell in the lawn and the handsome, sturdy door I'd built from cedar planks, which sat nestled between 2 newly planted lilac bushes. Laura was ecstatic. She called it her vegetable vault. We were proud. We had followed the rules, respected the law, and created something that was both useful and beautiful. It was a monument to hard work and careful planning. We had no idea it was also about to become the central battlefield in a war we never wanted to fight. The first salvo from Karen arrived not as a shouted threat, but as a crisp white envelope in our mailbox bearing the official-looking Oak Ridge HOA logo. Inside, on thick self-important letterhead, was a notice of violation. It cited bylaw 14.7, unapproved structures and alterations, and demanded the immediate removal of the unapproved subterranean bunker from my property. It imposed an initial fine of $100 and threatened daily fines of $25 for every day the violation remained. The letter was signed with a flourish by Karen Miller, President, Oak Ridge HOA. I read it, then read it again. Subterranean bunker. The language was deliberately inflammatory, designed to provoke and intimidate. But the most interesting part was the citation of bylaw 14.7. I walked over to my office and pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants, the pages already tabbed and highlighted from my initial research. I flipped to 14.7. It stated clear as day that any shed, gazebo, deck, fence, or other above-ground structure required approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The key words were above ground. My root cellar was, by definition, subterranean. The bylaw she was citing didn't apply, and she either knew it and was hoping I wouldn't check, or she was too incompetent to understand the very rules she was tasked with enforcing. My money was on a combination of both. This was my first clue that I wasn't dealing with a rational administrator, but with a petty tyrant who wielded rules like a club, without regard for their actual meaning. So I began to build my fortress of paper. I sat down at my computer and composed my response. It was polite, professional, and surgically precise. I acknowledged receipt of her letter. I then quoted bylaw 14.7 directly back to her, bolding the phrase above-ground structure. I calmly explained that a root cellar is a subterranean structure and therefore not subject to the cited bylaw. I attached a copy of my county-issued building permit, highlighting the official stamps and signatures, to demonstrate that the structure was fully legal and approved by the governing municipal authority. I also included a photograph of the completed project, showing how it was seamlessly integrated into the landscape with only the small door visible. I concluded by stating that since no bylaw had been violated, no fine was owed, and I considered the matter closed. I printed the letter, made 3 copies for my own records, and sent the original via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was a critical step my father, a lawyer, had taught me long ago. Create an undeniable record that your correspondence was sent and received. It costs a few extra dollars, but in a dispute, that green signature card is worth its weight in gold. A week later, the green card came back with a scrawled signature. A few days after that, a second envelope arrived. This one was angrier. The fine had been increased to $250 for failure to comply. The letter now accused me of willful disregard for community standards and creating a potential soil stability hazard. This was a new and baseless accusation, a clear escalation. She was making things up. Soil stability hazard? I laughed out loud. I had designed the retaining walls to standards used for highway embankments. The only thing unstable here was her grip on reality. I drafted a second letter, even more formal this time. I again referenced the inapplicability of bylaw 14.7. In response to her new claim, I wrote, regarding your unsubstantiated assertion of a soil stability hazard, the structure was designed by a licensed professional engineer, myself, and the plans were reviewed and approved by the county engineering department as part of the permitting process. I have attached a copy of the geological survey of my property as well as the structural calculations for the cellar walls, which far exceed all local and state building codes for retaining structures. If you have evidence to the contrary from a licensed geotechnical engineer, I would be happy to review it. Otherwise, this claim is baseless, libelous, and I demand you retract it in writing. I was turning her own bureaucratic tactics against her. She wanted to play with paperwork? I had binders full of it. I sent this letter along with its thicket of attachments via certified mail. This was no longer a simple disagreement. It was a campaign. My dining room table began to transform into a command center. I had a binder labeled HOA correspondence, a folder for permits and plans, and a timeline of events taped to the wall. Laura watched me with a worried expression. Mark, are you sure this is worth it? She seems unhinged. I put my arm around her. It is, I said, my voice firm. This isn't about the cellar anymore, Laura. It's about a bully who thinks she can intimidate people into submission. If we let her win this, where does it stop? Will she tell you what color flowers you can plant? Will she fine us because our son's car is 10 years old? You don't give an inch to people like that. You hold the line. She nodded, her resolve firming. She knew I was right. This was a fight for the quiet enjoyment of our home, a right we had earned. The battle lines were drawn, and Karen was about to find out that my supply of paper, patience, and procedural ammunition was far deeper than she could possibly imagine. The paper war was one front, but Karen, being a master of petty tyranny, quickly opened another, the court of public opinion. She started her smear campaign subtly at first. During her morning power walks around the neighborhood, she would stop and chat with other residents, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I saw it myself one morning as I was getting the newspaper. She was talking to my next-door neighbor, Brenda, a sweet woman who mostly kept to herself. Karen was pointing toward my backyard, her hands gesturing wildly, her face a mask of grave concern. When she saw me, she gave a tight, venomous smile and waddled on. A few hours later, Brenda knocked on my door. Mark, she began, looking uncomfortable. Karen was just telling me you built some kind of underground room. She said she's worried about it collapsing and affecting my property line, and that it might attract vermin. I sighed. It was exactly what I expected. Brenda, can I show you something? I led her into my office and showed her the county permit. I showed her the blueprints. Then I took her into the backyard. I opened the heavy cedar door to the root cellar and flicked on the light. The cool, clean air washed over us. The smooth concrete walls were painted a bright white. Neat wooden shelves lined the walls, already holding a few of Laura's early season jars of strawberry jam. This is it, I said. It's a root cellar, like our grandparents had. It's for storing vegetables. It's cleaner than my garage and probably stronger than my house. As for your property line, the entire structure is more than 20 feet away from it, double the county setback requirement. Brenda's eyes went wide. Oh, she said, a wave of relief washing over her face. This is wonderful. It's not a dirt hole at all. It's a proper room. Karen made it sound like you just dug a trench and thrown a board over it. I nodded. That's her strategy, Brenda. Fear. She's trying to turn the neighborhood against me because she doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. Brenda left reassured, but the poison had already started to spread. A few days later, I was mowing my front lawn when one of Karen's known cronies, a man named Gary who served as the HOA's treasurer, drove past. He slowed his oversized SUV, rolled down the window and yelled, "Better fill that hole before you sink the whole neighborhood, Henderson," before speeding off. It was childish, but it was a sign that the battle lines were being drawn. Some residents bought her story hook, line, and sinker. They were the ones who thrived on drama, who enjoyed the feeling of being on the right side of a manufactured conflict. They would give me cold stares when I retrieved my mail. I overheard one of them talking at the community pool, saying my illegal bunker was going to tank everyone's property values. But others were more circumspect. They were the quiet majority, people who just wanted to be left alone and were wary of the HOA's overreach. They had seen Karen's brand of governance before. The nitpicking letters about garbage cans left out an hour too long. The public shaming in the community newsletter for unpulled weeds. They avoided my gaze, not out of hostility, but out of a desire not to get involved, not to end up in Karen's crosshairs themselves. This was her true source of power, the fear of being targeted. I knew I had to counter her narrative directly. I couldn't let her control the flow of information. I decided to host a barbecue. I invited my immediate neighbors, including Brenda and a few other families on the street I was friendly with. I didn't mention the HOA dispute on the invitation. I just billed it as a casual get-together. When they arrived, I let them enjoy the food and conversation. Then when the moment was right, I casually said, "Hey, would you all like to see the project Laura and I just finished?" I led them to the backyard and gave them the same tour I gave Brenda. The reaction was universal. Awe, admiration, and a little bit of envy. "Wow, I wish I had one of these," said a neighbor named Tom. "My wife would kill for this much storage." Another neighbor, Maria, ran her hand along the smooth concrete block. "You built this yourself?" "Mark, this is incredible. It's so professional." That's when I laid it all out for them. I calmly explained the situation with Karen. I didn't rant or rave. I just presented the facts. I showed them the bylaw she was citing. I showed them my county permit. I showed them the threatening letters and my rational, documented responses. I let them see the truth for themselves. By the end of the evening, I had forged a small but crucial alliance. They had seen the cellar, they had seen my evidence, and they had seen Karen's aggression for what it was, a baseless abuse of power. Tom, who worked in real estate, scoffed at the idea it would lower property values. "Are you kidding? A unique feature like this, built to code? If anything, it's a selling point. It adds character." The tide was beginning to turn, one neighbor at a time. The community was no longer a monolith under Karen's control. It was now fractured, with a growing pocket of resistance forming right in her own backyard. She had intended to isolate me, to make me a pariah. Instead, she had inadvertently forced me to build bridges with my neighbors, strengthening the very community she claimed to be protecting. Her strategy was backfiring, and she was about to double down on her mistakes. The barbecue was a turning point, but I knew that swaying a few neighbors wasn't enough to win the war. Karen still held the institutional power of the HOA. She controlled the board, the newsletter, and the checkbook. I needed more than just friendly neighbors. I needed allies with teeth. My first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One evening, an older gentleman who lived 3 streets over, George, rang my doorbell. I recognized him from his meticulous rose garden, a local legend in its own right. He was a quiet man, a retired accountant, and he held a thick manila folder in his hands. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice soft but firm, "my name is George Gable. I heard what Karen is doing to you. I'm not surprised." He paused, then held up the folder. "She tried to do the same to me 3 years ago." I invited him in, and he spread the contents of the folder across my dining room table, which was now my permanent command center. It was a mirror image of my own struggle, a case study in Karen's pathology. His crime had been installing a small, decorative stone border around his prize-winning rose garden. It was no more than 4 inches high, elegant, and tasteful. Karen had declared it an unapproved fence and initiated the same campaign of fines and threats against him. George, being an accountant, had fought back with the same meticulous documentation that I had. His folder was filled with copies of letters, photos, and bylaw citations. He showed me how she had misquoted rules, invented violations, and harassed him for months. She eventually backed down, George explained, but only after I threatened to sue the HOA board members personally for harassment. Her power is built on bluffing. She folds when someone calls her on it with the threat of real legal consequences. He tapped his folder. I've been keeping this just in case, and I've been talking to others. There's a pattern. A woman on Maple Lane was fined for having a non-conforming welcome mat. A family on the corner was threatened with a lien because their basketball hoop was, and I quote, aesthetically displeasing. George's file was a goldmine. It established a clear pattern of abuse, a history of Karen weaponizing the HOA's authority for personal vendettas and petty whims. This wasn't just about my root cellar. It was a systemic problem. What she's doing is a breach of fiduciary duty, George said, his accountant's mind clicking into gear. The board has a duty to act in good faith and in the best interest of the community, not to pursue the president's personal grudges. Every letter she sends from the HOA's lawyer costs us all money. This conversation solidified my next move. I needed legal counsel, not just to defend myself, but to go on the offensive. As fate would have it, I didn't have to look far. A young couple had recently moved in down the street. The wife, Sarah, was a lawyer. I had met her briefly at my barbecue, where she'd been fascinated by the legal aspects of the dispute. I gave her a call. I laid out the whole story, from the first letter to George's file. I could practically hear the gears turning over the phone. Mark, this is more than just a simple bylaw dispute, she said, her voice sharp with professional interest. This is a classic case of selective enforcement and harassment by an HOA board. George's file is the key. It establishes a pattern. Her actions against you aren't an isolated incident. They're part of a larger campaign of misconduct. We met the next day. Sarah, sharp and energetic, spread my documents next to George's on the table. She was a litigator who specialized in contract and property law. Looking at our files was like giving a shark a drop of blood. Okay, she said, her eyes gleaming. Here's the plan. First, we send a cease and desist letter from my firm to the HOA board. Not just to Karen, but to every board member. We'll put them all on notice. We'll outline the baselessness of their claims against you, cite your county permits, and detail the pattern of harassment using the examples from George's file. We'll demand they retract the fines, issue a formal apology, and cease all communication with you on this matter. She continued, this does two things. It formalizes the dispute and shows you're not backing down. More importantly, it puts the other board members on the hook. Right now, they're probably just rubber stamping whatever Karen puts in front of them. Once they get a letter from a law firm threatening to name them as individuals in a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, they're going to start paying attention. Their personal assets could be at risk. That will break her monolithic control. This was the strategic escalation I needed. It was moving the fight from my mailbox to the boardroom. Sarah's second idea was even better. While they're reeling from that, she said, a grin spreading across her face, you need to go on the offense. You mentioned you're an engineer. You said Karen's big legacy in the neighborhood is that new gazebo by the community pond? I nodded. She was insufferable about it. It was her pet project. Perfect, Sarah said. HOA boards, especially ones led by people like Karen, love to cut corners on their own projects while holding homeowners to impossible standards. It's hypocrisy 101. You need to launch a counter-investigation. Go to the county and pull the public records for that gazebo. The permits, the plans, the inspection reports. Go over them with a fine-tooth comb. If she was as sloppy with that as she is with the bylaws, I guarantee you'll find something. And when you do, we don't just complain to the HOA, we go straight back to the county. The plan was brilliant. It was a classic pincer movement. A legal front to sow discord and fear within the board, and an investigative front to expose Karen's own incompetence and hypocrisy. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The very next day, I put Sarah's plan into motion. The first step was a trip to the county records office. The same building where I'd filed for my own permit months earlier. This time, however, I wasn't submitting plans. I was requesting them. I filled out a public records request form for all documents related to the Oak Ridge Community Gazebo project: building permits, architectural drawings, contractor bids, invoices, and all inspection reports. The clerk, the same man Dave who had processed my root cellar application, gave me a knowing look. Gazebo, huh? That was a fast one. They pushed that through pretty quick last spring. His comment was a small but significant flag. In construction, fast often means sloppy. A few days later, I got a call that the documents were ready. I went back and paid the copying fee, walking out with a banker's box overflowing with paper. Back in my command center, I spread the documents across the dining room table. It felt like being back in the Corps, analyzing intelligence before a major operation. Laura brought me a cup of coffee, looking at the mountain of paper with a wry smile. "You're in your element, aren't you?" she asked. "I'm just a guy who likes to be thorough," I replied. But she was right. This was a puzzle, and I was determined to solve it. For the next 3 nights, I lived in that box of documents. I cross-referenced invoices with material lists on the blueprints. I compared the contractor's license information with the state database. I read every word of the inspection reports. At first, everything seemed frustratingly in order. The permits were filed, the contractor was licensed. The initial inspections, foundation and framing, were signed off. Karen, it seemed, had been just competent enough to create a plausible paper trail. But my engineering sense, that gut feeling honed by years of spotting shortcuts on job sites, told me something was wrong. The cost, for one thing. The winning bid for the project was almost 20% lower than the other 2 bids. That's a huge red flag. It either means the contractor is incredibly efficient or they're cutting corners somewhere. I focused on the blueprints. They called for a standard concrete pier foundation with 4 piers sunk 4 feet deep to get below the frost line. The electrical plan specified underground conduit for the wiring to the overhead light and outlets. Standard stuff. Then I turned to the invoices. I saw the receipt for the concrete. The quantity ordered was just enough for piers about 2.5 feet deep, not the specified 4. A corner cut to save time and money, but one that could lead to frost heave and an unstable structure over time. It was a significant violation, but hard to prove without digging. Then I found the real bombshell. I was looking at the invoice for the electrical supplies. I saw charges for the light fixture, the outlets, the switches, but there was no charge for underground rated conduit. Instead, there was a charge for standard interior-grade Romex wiring. My blood ran cold. There is no universe in which it is acceptable to run standard interior wiring directly buried in the ground. It's not just a code violation, it's an electrocution and fire hazard waiting to happen. The wire's insulation isn't designed to withstand moisture and soil contact. It would inevitably degrade, energizing the surrounding earth or the metal structure of the gazebo itself. Anyone touching it in the wrong conditions could be killed. I frantically searched the inspection reports again. The foundation and framing were signed off, but the final electrical inspection? It was missing. There was a request for the inspection in the file, but no corresponding report showing that it had ever been conducted or passed. They had likely finished the project, connected the power illegally, and simply never called for the final inspection, hoping no one would ever check. Karen, in her rush to get her legacy project completed and under budget, had overseen the construction of a death trap. She had endangered every man, woman, and child in our community. The hypocrisy was staggering. This woman, who was trying to destroy my perfectly safe, over-engineered root cellar over a non-existent rule, had signed off on a public structure that was a genuine, life-threatening hazard. I felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. This was no longer about a property dispute. This was about public safety. I meticulously documented my findings. I highlighted the blueprint specification for the 4-foot piers. I highlighted the concrete invoice showing the insufficient quantity. I highlighted the electrical plan calling for underground conduit. I highlighted the invoice for the wrong type of wire, and I put a giant red circle around the empty space where the final electrical inspection report should have been. I compiled everything into a neat, damning report. I now held the weapon that would not only end this fight, but would obliterate Karen's credibility and authority. But the timing had to be perfect. Sarah's legal letter had gone out to the board members and the fuse was lit. Now I just had to wait for Karen to make her final, fatal mistake, calling a public meeting to humiliate me. I had my counter-offensive prepared, and I was ready to deploy it in the most public, most devastating way possible. The trap was set. All I had to do was let her walk into it. While I held my bombshell report in reserve, Karen and the HOA board were reacting to Sarah's legal salvo. The cease and desist letter, sent via courier to Karen and via certified mail to the other 4 board members at their homes, had the desired effect. It was like dropping a grenade into a hornet's nest. My neighbor Tom, the real estate agent, heard about the fallout from another board member's panicked wife. Apparently, the other members, Gary the treasurer, a timid woman named Cynthia, who was the secretary, and 2 other rubber stampers, had been under the impression that this was a routine bylaw enforcement. They had been signing off on Karen's letters and fines without much thought, trusting her interpretation of the rules. Sarah's letter changed everything. It didn't just address the HOA as a corporate entity, it named them. It explained the concept of breach of fiduciary duty in stark, terrifying terms. It pointed out that their liability insurance might not cover them if they were found to be acting in bad faith or pursuing a personal vendetta. The phrase personally liable for all legal costs and damages tends to focus the mind wonderfully. The board convened an emergency executive session, a meeting to which I was not privy, but whose frantic energy radiated through the neighborhood grapevine. According to Tom's source, the meeting was chaos. The other board members, terrified of being sued, wanted to drop the matter immediately. They wanted to retract the fines and walk away. But Karen would not have it. Her ego was too deeply invested. Backing down now would be a public admission of defeat, an unthinkable humiliation. She reportedly threw a tantrum, accusing them of cowardice and disloyalty. She insisted my root cellar was a clear and present danger, and that my lawsuit threat was a bluff. She argued that they had to make an example of me, or everyone in the neighborhood would start digging unauthorized bunkers. Her argument was based on emotion and fear, while theirs was based on a sudden and acute sense of financial self-preservation. The pressure on me, however, did not cease. It mutated. The official violation letters stopped, but the harassment became more personal, more desperate. Karen now saw this as a zero-sum game. One morning, Laura came inside from her garden, her face pale. "Mark, you need to see this." Someone had dumped a bag of garbage into one of her prize-winning rose bushes, the ones right near the property line. There was no direct proof it was Karen, but the petty, vindictive nature of the act had her signature all over it. The next day, an anonymous call was made to animal control, claiming our golden retriever, Buddy, was being kept in inhumane conditions. An officer showed up, saw a happy, healthy dog with a full bowl of water and a shady yard to roam in, and left, apologizing for the inconvenience. He even commented, "We get these spite calls all the time in neighborhoods with aggressive HOAs." The escalation was stressful, particularly for Laura. She began to worry about what they would do next. "This is getting out of hand, Mark," she said one evening, her voice trembling slightly. "It's one thing to get letters. It's another for them to start coming after my garden, after Buddy. It feels like we're under siege." I pulled her close, my own anger simmering beneath a calm exterior. "I know, and I'm sorry, but this is the last gasp of a dying tyrant. She's lost control of her board. She has no legal ground, so she's resorting to these pathetic tactics. It's a sign that she knows she's losing. My plan is in motion. The trap is ready. We just have to hold on a little longer. I promise you, this will all be over soon, and she will never bother us, or anyone else in this neighborhood, again." My reassurance helped, but I knew that words weren't enough. I needed to end this. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. A new notice appeared on the community bulletin board, a flyer printed on bright pink paper. It announced a special community meeting to be held in the common area clubhouse. The agenda item was singular: discussion and vote on remediation action for unapproved structure at 112 Oak Drive. My address, and beneath that, another line. County Building Inspector, Mr. Evans, will be in attendance to provide an expert opinion. A cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. This was it. This was the public spectacle she had been craving. She had finally convinced her wavering board to agree to this meeting, likely by promising them that a county official would publicly vindicate her and condemn me. She envisioned a public shaming, a moment where the full weight of the county and the community would come crashing down on me. She was bringing in an outside expert to prove she was right. What she failed to realize was that I had already done my homework on that expert's own field of play. She was inviting the referee to a game she had already lost, and I was about to hand him the evidence to prove it. I called Sarah immediately. "It's happening," I said. "She called the meeting. She's bringing the county inspector." Sarah let out a low whistle. "Oh, Karen, you magnificent fool. This is better than I could have hoped for. Are you ready?" I looked at the neat damning file on my desk. "I've been ready for weeks." The stage was set for the final act. Karen was about to host a party, and I was about to be the guest of honor who burned the whole house down with the truth. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse was buzzing with a nervous energy. It was a sterile, beige room that smelled faintly of air freshener and simmering resentment. Karen had managed to pack the place. At least 50 residents were crammed into uncomfortable folding chairs. The front row was occupied by her loyalists, including Gary the treasurer, who looked smugly confident. The other board members were seated at a long table at the front, looking profoundly uncomfortable, like men waiting for a verdict. I saw my allies, George and Tom, sitting near the back, giving me subtle, encouraging nods. Laura was beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. I had told her the full plan, and while she was nervous, she also had a glint of fierce pride in her eyes. I carried a single, slim leather portfolio. It contained my counter report. We took our seats in the middle of the room, positioning ourselves to be seen and heard. Karen, dressed in a vibrant purple caftan that made her look like a royal barge, stood at a podium. She beamed at the crowd, soaking in the attention. This was her moment. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with faux gravitas. "We are here tonight to address a serious issue of community safety and compliance." She launched into a 10-minute tirade, painting me as a rogue homeowner who had endangered the neighborhood with a massive, unpermitted, and structurally unsound bunker. She used all the inflammatory language she could muster: sinkhole, liability, imminent collapse. She conveniently failed to mention that I had a county permit or that the bylaws didn't cover my project. It was a masterclass in propaganda, full of half-truths and outright lies, delivered with the conviction of a zealot. "But you don't have to take my word for it," she announced grandly, gesturing toward the back of the room. "We have a special guest tonight. Mr. David Evans, a senior inspector from the county's Building and Safety Department, has graciously agreed to join us to provide his expert assessment." A man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and a weary but professional air stood up. He wore a county logo polo shirt and carried a clipboard and a large flashlight. This was Inspector Evans. Karen's plan was clear. Evans would take a cursory look at my cellar, declare it unsafe based on her biased description, and she would then have the political capital to force a vote to have it filled in. "Mr. Evans," Karen said, her voice syrupy sweet, "if you would be so kind as to accompany us to the property in question, we can all see this hazard for ourselves." She was leading the crowd like a flock of sheep to a slaughter. I stood up. "That won't be necessary just yet," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to fill the room. All eyes turned to me. Karen's face tightened. "Mr. Henderson, this is my meeting." "With all due respect, Karen," I replied, using her first name to subtly strip away her title, "you've made some very serious accusations. Before we go on a field trip, I think Mr. Evans and the rest of our neighbors deserve to see the actual documentation." Before she could protest, I walked to the front of the room and handed Inspector Evans my portfolio. "Mr. Evans," I said, "in this portfolio, you will find a complete set of the blueprints for my root cellar, my official county-issued building permit for said structure, and the structural engineering calculations, which show it exceeds all county codes for subterranean construction." Evans took the portfolio, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He opened it and began to flip through the pages. The room was silent. You could see his professional demeanor take over. He scanned the permit, his eyes lingering on the official stamp. He studied the blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. Karen was starting to look nervous. This wasn't going according to her script. After a few long minutes, Evans looked up. He addressed me, not Karen. Mr. Henderson, these plans are exceptionally thorough, and this permit is valid. On paper, this is one of the most well-documented private projects I've seen in a while. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face was turning a shade of angry red that clashed with her purple caftan. "But the construction," she sputtered. "He could have cut corners. It needs to be inspected." "I agree," I said, turning to Evans. "I would be proud to have you inspect my work. Shall we?" I led the procession out of the clubhouse and down the street to my home. The crowd followed, a strange parade of curiosity and morbid excitement. Karen marched near the front, trying to regain control, whispering to Evans about hidden defects. I calmly led them to my backyard, to the small cedar door in the hillside. I opened it, switched on the lights, and stood back. "After you, Mr. Evans." The inspector descended the steps, his big flashlight beam cutting through the cool air. He spent a full 10 minutes inside. We could hear him tapping on the walls, examining the ceiling, checking the ventilation pipes. The crowd waited in hushed anticipation. Karen stood with her arms crossed, a smug look returning to her face, as if she was certain he would find some fatal flaw. Finally, Evans emerged, a thoughtful expression on his face. He turned to the assembled crowd. "I have inspected the structure," he announced. "The concrete blockwork is exemplary. The waterproofing is professionally applied. The ventilation is to code. This root cellar isn't just safe, it's over-engineered. Frankly, it's built better than most of the houses in this development." A collective gasp went through the crowd. My wife squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break it. Karen looked like she had been slapped. But, she stammered, it's a violation." Evans looked at her, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, as far as the county is concerned, this is a permitted, inspected, and soundly constructed building. Any issue you have with it is a private civil matter for your HOA. My official assessment is that there is absolutely nothing wrong with it." The first part of the trap had sprung perfectly. I had been publicly vindicated. But I wasn't done. The main event was about to begin. The crowd was already buzzing, the tide of opinion having turned against Karen in a dramatic, public fashion. Her face was a storm cloud of disbelief and rage. She had brought the expert witness to condemn me, and he had ended up praising my work in front of the entire community. Her authority was crumbling before her eyes. Now was the time for the coup de grace. I let the murmurs die down, allowing her humiliation to marinate for a moment. Then I cleared my throat, and all eyes snapped back to me. "Mr. Evans," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound authority that I had earned in the last 10 minutes. "I'm grateful for your professional assessment of my property. And while you are here, in your official capacity, there is another community structure that I and several other homeowners have serious safety concerns about." Karen's head whipped around, her eyes wide with confusion, then dawning horror. She knew what was coming. I pointed across the manicured lawn toward the community pond, where the silhouette of the gazebo stood against the twilight sky. "The Oak Ridge Community Gazebo," I announced. "It was completed this spring. It's my understanding that all public use structures require a final inspection to be granted a certificate of occupancy, especially if they have electrical wiring." Inspector Evans's professional focus sharpened. "That is correct," he said, turning his gaze toward the gazebo. "You have concerns?" I walked over to him and opened my portfolio again, flipping past my own cellar plans to the second section I had prepared. "I do," I said, handing him my neatly compiled report. "As an engineer, I reviewed the public records for the project. I have reason to believe the foundation piers were not sunk to the depth specified in the approved plans. More critically, I have evidence suggesting that standard, non-waterproof interior-grade electrical wiring was used for the underground feed. And I can find no record of a final electrical inspection ever being completed or passed. If I'm correct, that structure isn't just a code violation. It's an active electrocution hazard." The words electrocution hazard landed like a physical blow. A wave of shock passed through the crowd. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. That gazebo was where families took photos, where teenagers hung out after school. Karen went white as a sheet. "That's a lie, a baseless accusation," she shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "He's just trying to deflect from his own violations." Evans ignored her completely. He was staring at my report, his face grim. He looked at the blueprint spec for the 4-foot piers, then at the copy of the concrete invoice. He looked at the receipt for the Romex wire. He flipped to the last page, where the spot for the final inspection report was conspicuously empty. He looked up, not at me, but at Karen. His voice was cold as ice. "Ma'am, as president of the HOA, you oversaw this project, correct?" Yes, it was my project," she stammered. "I made sure it was beautiful." "We're not talking about beauty, ma'am. We're talking about safety," Evans said sternly. He clicked on his large flashlight and started walking purposefully toward the gazebo. "Let's go have a look." The entire crowd, now a silent, fearful mob, followed him. I walked near the front with George and Tom. Karen stumbled along behind us, her bravado completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. We reached the gazebo. It looked charming in the fading light, with its little lantern glowing overhead. Evans didn't waste any time. He went straight to one of the main support posts and used the heel of his boot to kick away the decorative mulch at its base. He scraped away a few inches of dirt with a pry bar he pulled from his tool belt. He didn't have to dig far. The concrete of the pier was visible just a few inches below the surface. "This pier is supposed to be 4 feet deep," he said to no one in particular. "This looks like it's barely 2. He then walked to the spot where the electrical lines should have been entering a conduit pipe from the ground. He knelt down, and this time, he used his hands to dig into the soft soil. A few seconds later, he stood up, holding a length of orange plastic-sheathed wire. It was unmistakably Romex. "Dear God," he muttered under his breath. He turned to the crowd, his face a grim mask. He held up the wire for all to see. "This is interior-grade wiring. It has no place being buried in the ground. The insulation will fail. This entire structure could become energized. The ground around it could become energized." He then walked over to the electrical box on the side of the gazebo, opened it with a screwdriver, and took one look inside. He stepped back and pulled a large bright red tag from his vest. It had the word "Condemned" printed on it in huge black letters. He attached it to the main post of the gazebo, right in the center for everyone to see. "This structure is hereby condemned as an imminent public safety hazard," he announced in a loud official voice. "The power to it must be cut immediately, and it is not to be entered or used by anyone. It is unsafe and must be demolished." The reversal was absolute. The weapon Karen had brought to destroy me had been turned against her with devastating effect. She stood frozen, staring at the red tag on her legacy project, her face a canvas of utter ruin. The community she had sought to rule through fear was now staring at her, not with admiration, but with a mixture of terror and contempt. She had not only been proven a hypocrite, she had been exposed as a reckless fool who had endangered their children to save a few dollars. Her reign was over. The aftermath of the public condemnation was swift and brutal. The sight of that red tag hanging on Karen's prize gazebo acted as a catalyst, releasing all the pent-up frustration and resentment that had been simmering in the community for years. The crowd didn't yell or riot. The reaction was colder, more damning. It was the quiet, furious contempt of people who realized they had been lied to and endangered. As Inspector Evans packed up his tools, he handed me his card. "Mr. Henderson, thank you. You may have prevented a real tragedy here tonight. If the new board has any questions about bringing this up to code, have them call me." The new board. The words hung in the air, a prophecy already coming true. Karen tried to salvage the situation, babbling about warranties and blaming the contractor. But no one was listening. Her voice, once a booming instrument of authority, was now a pathetic, ignored squeak. People just stared at her, then turned and walked away, shaking their heads in disgust. George, Tom, and I stood together, watching the crowd disperse. "I think," George said with a quiet, satisfied smile, "it's time to start a recall petition." The very next day, the petition papers were drawn up. George, with his accountant's precision, and Sarah, with her legal expertise, made sure they were ironclad. We didn't even have to go door to door. We just set up a table near the mailboxes, and a line formed. People who had been afraid to speak out, who had avoided my gaze for weeks, now eagerly signed their names, sharing their own stories of Karen's petty tyrannies. The welcome mat lady, the basketball hoop family, everyone had a grievance. The petition to recall Karen and her entire crony board gained the required number of signatures in less than 48 hours. The financial fallout was the final nail in her coffin. The HOA was now legally obligated to demolish the hazardous gazebo. Estimates came in, and the cost to tear it down, dispose of the materials properly, and then rebuild it to code was astronomical. It would completely wipe out the HOA's reserve fund, and then some. At the emergency board meeting, the last one Karen would ever preside over, the new reality crashed down. Gary, the treasurer who had been so smug just days before, presented the numbers with a pale, sweaty face. To cover the costs, the board had no choice but to levy a significant special assessment on every single homeowner. The very people Karen had claimed to be protecting were now going to have to pay out of their own pockets for her incompetence and arrogance. When the notice of the special assessment went out, her last vestiges of support evaporated. Even her most loyal cronies turned on her when they realized her crusade was going to cost them real money. The recall vote was a mere formality. Karen was removed from her position as president and from the board in a landslide. The other board members, seeing the writing on the wall, had already tendered their resignations. An interim board was formed, with George Gable reluctantly but dutifully stepping in as president, Tom as vice president, and Sarah agreeing to serve as a non-voting legal advisor. Their first official act was to send me a formal letter on behalf of the Oak Ridge HOA, retracting all violations and fines, and offering a sincere apology for the harassment my family had endured. Their second act was to schedule a community-wide review of all HOA bylaws, with the goal of eliminating vagueness and preventing the kind of selective enforcement Karen had thrived on. The symbolic end to the conflict came a few weeks later. I was in my backyard watching Laura as she happily arranged jars of freshly canned peaches on the shelves of the root cellar. The air was cool and smelled of earth and sweet fruit. The cellar was no longer a point of contention, but a sanctuary of peace, exactly as we had intended. In the distance, we could hear the sound of machinery. It was the demolition crew, tearing down the last remnants of Karen's condemned gazebo. The whining of saws and the crunch of splintering wood was, to my ears, the sweetest music I had ever heard. It was the sound of justice. Karen, I later heard, put her house up for sale. The public humiliation, the financial fallout, and the complete loss of her social standing were too much for her to bear. She couldn't stand to live in a community where she was no longer in charge, where her neighbors looked at her not with fear, but with pity and disdain. Her reign of terror, built on a foundation of intimidation and paper-thin authority, had been brought down by a structure of concrete and rebar, and by the simple, unwavering truth. My family had our peace back, the community had its integrity back, and my root cellar stood as a quiet, sturdy monument to the fact that when a bully pushes, sometimes you have to push back with a foundation of your own.